It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person was torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day listeners and welcome to Hard Hats and High Vis with the two Jacks, Jack the Insider, that's me, Peter Hoysted to my mum, and Hong Kong Jack, that's Jack Hoysted, former Labor man, now resident in Hong Kong. G'day, Jack.
G'day.
I know you've got the day off today, public holiday, Labor Day in Hong Kong.
Well, it's Labor Day, or more precisely May Day, I suppose, in Singapore, Hong Kong, and all through China. And listeners will be able to tell the difference today because they're not knocking up a 60-storey building right next to me. So,
it's not a celebration of the 40-hour week, is it? Because I don't think you have one of those in Hong Kong. It's more the traditional May Day Labor holiday. I think Hong Kong has more public holidays than any other country protectorate on earth.
We do like a public holiday here, and they're very inclined to celebrate all of the various religious festivals. So we like a day off.
Excellent work. And look, Hard Hats and High Vis is an election podcast where we go behind the media coverage, behind the Hard Hats and High Vis theatre, and use our expertise developed over too many elections to count, Jack. Too many because it would make us seem very, very old if we could remember. we actually counted all the ones that we can remember. Yeah, but we'll tell you what's really going on behind the scenes, and that's because politics is a game where often things are not as they appear. And so we'll try and strip back some of the veneer there and give you what's going on. And listeners, we need your help to spread the good word on this podcast to political animals everywhere. If you like what you're listening to, please give us a shout out on social media. Tell your friends, spread the good word and get our listener numbers up. Jack, let's kick it off. Has Albanese's COVID absence, he was on the pine for 7 days, has that been good or bad for Labor?
Well, I don't think it's been bad. His little visual stuff was okay.
Yeah, he did his interviews and things like that.
It was certainly a win for Jason Clare,
yes,
who's gone up the table with a bullet. He's had a really good week.
The Australian had a bit of a comment from readers there saying Jason Clare should be the leader.
Yeah,
a bit late for that, though, isn't he? A bit late for that.
It is a bit late for that. I thought he fumbled the ball a little bit yesterday before the launch. He sounded a bit like Bill Shorten had been supplying him with 2019 Bill Shorten zingers. He put them over a bit better than Bill, but the politician as stand-up comedian thing never works that well.
It just doesn't work. They really don't know how to tell a joke. So there's always this long lead-up, and then they fumble their way through the punchline.
Yeah, there are a few exceptions. There was Bob Hawke's wonderful joke about Indira Gandhi, which we won't put back on air.
Another time for sure.
But very few of them can tell a joke, and I thought Jason, well, you shouldn't have done it, but
Yeah, but overall, good performance, and we'll talk about a policy that he launched shortly. But there was the Labor launch last night, and it is, of course, as we say, not quite May 1, it's the 2nd of May, and as of the 9th of May, voters can wander down to the ballot box and start voting. So we're only a week away before that happens. So we had the Labor launch. Do launches matter? I don't think they changed too many votes, do they?
I think they used to matter. Back when we had, 2 television stations and everybody watched the same thing on the telly.
You were a country boy. We had 4 in the city.
Yeah, well, that's probably right. And in those days it did matter, but I don't think they do matter much.
It's really now a sort of celebration for the faithful, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Yeah.
And so they tried. I noticed PJ Cody, the great man, was there, and you
other
wouldn't believe,
bloke.
and and there were numerous selfies. I think Kevin Rudd is still popular. I saw Elbow giving him a big hug. So they dragged Kevin Rudd out of the mire there, and all was forgiven briefly, and a good time was had by all.
Yeah. So I don't know that matter much. I was more impressed with the press conference on the Saturday before the launch.
Yeah,
I didn't think it went well for Labor. I think I might have sent you a WhatsApp.
This was the team job, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah. I think I might have sent you a WhatsApp and said, "Look, for Labor's sake, I hope no one's watching this." And I'm pretty sure no one was.
That's it.
All the shadow ministers were falling over one another to get to the microphone so they could announce yet another new program, and the programs all seem designed to make us taller and better looking and happier and better off and
money and big money.
And big money, and no one would be left behind. So everyone would be better off and no one would be worse off. And that was sort of reminding me of Labor in 2019 and the problems they had with over-promising. And people just looked at them and said, "Nah, that's not going to happen."
No, yeah, and not getting the opportunity to deliver.
No.
Yeah, look, I do think, well, for listeners, I just want to remind listeners for the first time, Jack actually provided Labor with a list of things that they should not be talking about. And I think number one was no big spending programs.
Yeah, pretty much.
And that's not to say you go in there no policies, but you don't start with the sort of multi-billion-dollar investments that you need to make. And Albanese so far has done that. He's basically saying it's going to be a change of government, but really just more of the same, but with different people.
Well, it's going to be a refreshment of the government and getting rid of a government that's tired and replacing it with a little bit of fresh energy. And that's the message I think they should be pushing all the time.
And that's that, as you say, that was a list of things that you created that they do need to talk about. And top of that list was, this is an old stale government that has run out of ideas and energy. And that was the message that they should be getting across ad nauseum, and they have been doing that. It's like
the reason you do that
is, Jack.
And the reason you do that is because that's the reason why Australians generally change their federal government.
Vote governments out. Yeah, it doesn't happen often. We're going to talk about that sense. There often is a very strong sense that a government is about to be hurled out. We got it very markedly in 2007, and then again in 2013. You felt across the country that there was going to be a change, and whether that's the sensation at the moment, we'll get to that shortly. Now, Labor has been policy light. There's no doubt about that. But Jason Clare, the star, the emerging star, a bloke who's kicked a couple of goals with his first couple of kicks in footy. Jason Clare, he's been around Labor for a long time, of course, but in terms of the leadership stakes, he really has stepped up. He is also Labor's housing spokesman, and they did release a policy yesterday, which is a very modest policy, helping 10,000 modest income earners. The government will co-buy a home for each of these 10,000 modest income earners by contributing up to 40% of the purchase price. Is that a good idea, Jack?
Well, it's probably good if you're trying to sell a house. It's going to bump up the housing prices straight away, I would have thought.
It's not going to take any of the heat out of housing, is it?
No, it's not.
But it's a $329 million policy to administer over 4 years. So that's a pretty small spend, isn't it?
It's just it's sending a signal. That's what it is, really.
Yeah. It is one of those topics, I dare say, that Labor needs to talk about housing. Yeah. There clearly is a housing shortage in this country, and there are rents going through the roof. and basically a lot of people, particularly the young under 40s, are saying we are being priced out of the housing market. This sort of scheme might just sort of add to their woes, but at least it's talking about one thing that Labor is strong at, and the coalition has been found to be doing nothing about for a very long time, and that's housing in the country, around the countryside, particularly in the big cities.
Yeah, it's a political play rather than a real policy, I think.
Yeah, that's what it seems like to me. 329 million is not going to solve a housing crisis in any country, and certainly not one with 25 million people, the majority of which live in big cities.
But it's solved mine.
I don't think a house of your substantial value would qualify, Jack. I think we are talking about houses way out in the suburbs, for the most part, new builds, I would think.
Yeah.
The other major thing that's coming, we are on the eve of it, is the RBA meets tomorrow, Jack, and they will look at interest rate rises. It's tipped that they will rise, if not tomorrow, then very, very soon. But if they do bring about, the RBA acts independent of government, of course. If they do bring about a rate rise, that would immediately mean the commercial or retail banks will raise their interest rates alongside, perhaps even a little bit more than the RBA raises the official cash rate. Must be said, the official cash rate's virtually negligible, isn't it? I think it's about 0.1%. So we're looking at a rise there. If not tomorrow, then within the next month or so. But it would be, if the RBA does jump them up tomorrow, it would not be a great look for the Morrison government, would it?
No, well, people sort of say, well, at least it's not going to be back to the 15% that you and I can remember. But it doesn't need to be. If you double the interest rate, if you take it from, take your mortgage rate from 3% to 6%, that's a big, big hit for a lot of people.
There's also the symbolic. Yeah, it is. It will be, certainly for those home buyers who've just jumped into the market, because they're bought probably at the top of the market and leveraged themselves. If they've leveraged themselves at 90 to even 100% of the cost of the house, they might be in a bit of strife if they haven't budgeted for a little bit of wiggle room, Jack.
That's right. But am I right in remembering there was an interest rate rise in during the 2007 campaign?
Yes, and it was. I remember it was a highly controversial. The coalition couldn't take a trick, and then they had that to deal with, and I think that was within a couple of weeks of the poll itself. And by that stage,
it was pretty much all over anyway.
It was all over by that stage. It was kind of the last nail in the Howard government coffin, and there was plenty of bleeding on their side with the RBA. How dare they, politicise this and all that sort of stuff. But there was no avoiding it, and interest rates went up at a time where interest rates were reasonably high, certainly not as low as they are at the moment. So that's something that we'll watch. Perhaps it adds that sort of symbolism around this very old style government, that confirms that sort of Labor narrative about an old style government really battling away. They're trying to establish themselves as better economic managers, but sort of struggling with the hard facts of it. There's some other things going on too, Jack, and I just wanted to talk about them. Andrew Constance, you would know, is the former New South Wales Treasurer and Transport Minister. He resigned from the New South Wales Parliament and is standing as the Liberal candidate for Gilmore, which is a seat held by Labor. And he said this election is not about Scott Morrison. And he went on to say that it was about building communities and what community, what communities themselves reflected as the best way forward and all this sort of stuff, which is kind of nice fluff, but really he was trying to downplay the leadership of Scott Morrison. And that's an issue for the coalition, isn't it?
If they're doing that, it must be. This sort of smacks of local feedback or internal bowling, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is indeed. That's exactly what it sounds like. Local feedback saying, no, thank you. Now, Gilmore, it must be said, I think Fiona Martin is the Labor MP there. It is probably, well, not probably, it is the Liberals' best chance in Australia of winning a Labor seat. And Constance is a sort of high-profile candidate. And really, if they stand any chance of even forming a minority government, you would think they need to win Gilmore to offset losses to their own marginals against Labor, and of course, potentially some of the losses to the Climate 200 independents in Melbourne and Sydney, and one in Perth. But the other thing that caught my eye, someone sent me a copy of a poster. In fact, it wasn't the poster, it was the big banner outside the electoral office in Shepparton, where the sitting member, Damien Drum, is retiring in the seat of Nichols, used to be called Murray. And there's the new candidate there, the new National Party candidate, and there's three from the Victorian lower house, three National Party candidates. There's Bridget McKenzie, and you look at that poster and go, what's wrong with this picture, Jack? What's wrong with this picture? And there's actually room, right? There's room, but there's someone missing. Any guess on who that might be?
It could be Barnaby.
Barnaby. And doesn't he make a colour photo look good, Barnaby? Yeah. So it's a surprise that he wasn't there. And this again comes back to this. We really don't want to talk about our leaders all that much.
Could be. Now I had to look up what the seat of Nichols, which area the seat of Nichols covered, because I hadn't heard of it.
Your old stomping ground, mate.
It used to be known as Murray, and I've got a disclosure here. I lived for 20 plus years in the seat of Murray, as it was then.
Shepparton up all the way to, Newmarket.
Cobram.
Cobram.
I lived in all of those places.
All those lovely places by the Murray there. It used to be called Murray, and for some reason they just decided that was old hat. I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with Murray. I mean, there was with Batman. There were political concerns about the name of Batman, and that was renamed. But Murray is the name of the river. So I don't think there's anything particularly wrong there, and I'm not sure who it was named after. Perhaps surpassed Doug Nichols, I think it could be named after. Could well be.
I suspect it was. My first thought it might have been Big John from Carlton.
Big John, well, he's from Maryborough.
It's a little bit out of the territory, but yeah.
Big John, the former Carlton captain, coach, premiership player, and legend of the game, AFL legend.
I suspect it's Pastor Doug Nichols, because I think he was originally from Cumragunja, which is in the electorate, or on the edge of the electorate, at Barmer there. So it could well be that. I'm not surprised really that Barnaby's a bit on the nose in a seat like Nichols. It's not really his territory. He's very much Queensland, Northern New South Wales kind of politician, and that doesn't necessarily play well as far south as the Murray.
Well, they do talk, the psephologists and commentators talk about the Barnaby line now, Jack, and it runs around the sort of central New South Wales, pretty much along the Darling River, and everything above is okay to mention Barnaby Joyce's name, but everything below, he is not to be mentioned, not to be photographed, not to be appearing on billboards, corflutes, or any signage around the place.
Well, we've known for a long time that there is a separate breed of Queensland politician, don't we? That you can, it's hard to imagine who's the big fella, Russ Hinds, ever being a politician south of the Tweed.
Yeah, well, look, it's definitely right. Some wonderful stories about Big Russ. He was a terrible human being. Of course, he had, I think, four charges of corruption outstanding when he fell off the branch. He would have left a nice old divot too when he landed. But yeah, it was part of that Joe Bjelke-Petersen regime. Perhaps not as bad as Joe, not as corrupt as Joe. When he was police minister, he had a good look around there and went, gee whiz, this is a bit rich even for me. And so Joe had to flick him out of the police ministry. But that's what we're seeing. The Joyce line, if we want to call that, but also, more importantly, and a very important seat for the coalition, the candidate there, the high-profile candidate, is downplaying the role of Scott Morrison. But it's really hard to downplay your leader because your leader he's the man. I mean, he's running around doing presses every day. He's lead off on the news and the election coverage of news every day. And so it really is one of those things that you can talk, it's all about communities and getting together and feeling warm and cuddly. But really, it's not something you can clearly do. You mentioned a piece in the Australian today, an op-ed from Chris Mitchell, the former editor-in-chief of the Australian, and he said that Morrison needs to put some distance between himself and Labor on climate change. Both have 50%. But both have net zeros by 2050. Both the coalition and Labor. They vary a little bit in terms of how to get there and what the benchmarks are along the way. But Chris reckons Morrison should get up and put some distance between themselves and Labor. Is that a good idea?
Well, he made the point that the last time that the two parties were aligned on climate change issues or climate change policies was 2007, and the Liberals lost, and that's a fair point to make. The other point I think it's important to note is that around the world, the net zero by 2050 target is being put on ice pretty much, especially in Europe. And that's partly as a result of the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
And the energy crisis around it.
That results from that.
If it's not a crisis now, it will be next week. I mean, it is really, really a big problem for Europe.
It is. So actions are being taken now in Germany, and plans are being made in Italy, etc., to walk back from their closure of coal-fired power stations, etc. They'll be busily dusting them off and reopening them. Pretty soon.
So, well, I hope they're in better nick than Chernobyl, but there's going to drive. I mean, the conflict in Ukraine is driving a lot of big problems for the world, not just the military invasion itself, but driving some big impacts on economies and energy policy. That whole concept of net zero by 2050 being dead was actually put about by National Party or LNP Senator, but National Party Senator for Queensland, Matt Canavan, who said last week to media that basically net zero by 2050 was dead. And of course that became a problem because the coalition had very sensitively put this decision together, and there was money thrown at the Nats and all this sort of stuff last year in order for Australia to move forward and hit that 2050 net zero target. I'm not quite sure how the coalition's going to get there, but all of a sudden Morrison had to deal with this issue of one of his coalition colleagues saying net zero by 2050 was dead. And he said, that's not our policy. That's not even National Party policy. That's That's not what we're talking about. We have this policy like this. So he has basically almost sort of painted himself into a corner over that. And this really does take away from Labor's issue of having to run two policies, one in central Queensland and one in Brunswick.
Well, they might both be in the same situation, having to have a kind of a two-faced policy, if you like.
Yeah, well, it's certainly, this is another reason why I just see that the coalition's campaign is not going well, in my view. I know we had Albo making slip-ups and basic mistakes in the first week. Thankfully got some COVID and got a chance to go away and have a good look at himself. But really, I don't reckon the coalition's campaign has been worth much at all.
Well, I think on issues like climate change, it's all very well for people will tell you that they are keen to meet the net zero by 50 target, et cetera, and they remain keen on it until you tell them that it's going to cost them money, and then they lose interest very quickly. And if the coalition are going to win the election or remain in government, more precisely, they need to understand that where their target, where their path to victory lies, people are not keen on spending money on climate change.
Well, their pathway to victory is they need to win Labor marginals, Jack. That's their pathway to victory. That's their only pathway to victory because, and we'll talk about the Teals in a moment, the Climate 200 independents, but it would seem likely that they are going to lose some of their blue ribbon seats. They've got 77 at the moment. It would seem likely that they're going to lose a couple in WA to Labor, a couple of their marginals there, and perhaps even a third to an independent. So when you do the maths on this, one in South Australia in Boothby, they look pretty much roll gold certainties to lose. And then there's a handful around the country. It doesn't look like there's going to be a lot of change in terms of seats at this stage, but it does look like Labor are going to pick up 6 or so, just on the numbers. And then the coalition will lose 2 or 3, maybe more, to the independents. So how on earth are they going to get, not to 76 necessarily, but to some sort of competitive number around perhaps 72 or 73. And the only answer to that is they must pick up Labor marginals. And it's hard to see where. I mean, I think Gilmore they've got a big chance there, but there's not a lot in Queensland that's in the offing. That's where they had the success in 2019, that they were able to basically pick up a Labor seat there or two there, and bolster their majorities in Queensland. But it seems like Queensland won't have a big impact on this election.
I think that Labor's only pathway to victory is to win a majority of seats in their own right.
Well, that brings us to our next topic, Jack. So that means Labor's got to win 76. They're currently on 69. So they need, well, they will be net 70 because they pick up the seat of Hawke, named after the great RJL. And so that will give them net 70, and they need 6 from there. On the betting, they are firm favourites to win 6, but they are either neck and neck or a couple of cents in front in another 3 others. So I guess what we're looking at is whether they're going over the next couple of weeks to get that sort of confidence among the general electorate to get to that majority. That's presuming they don't lose any. So
there's a misconception that I keep hearing from progressive pals that Labor has a pathway to victory through the Teal, the independents winning those seats. And I just don't see that as a pathway to victory for Labor at all.
I think a lot of people are blind to it, and it's something we talked about in last week's program was the rise of the Climate 200 independents, where they are taking on and are very good chances to win blue ribbon seats in Melbourne, the blue ribbon seat of Kooyong, where the sitting member is the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg. Tim Wilson, another prominent MP in Goldstein, is under threat. The sitting member of Wentworth, Dave Sharma, is under threat from the independent candidate Allegra Spender. Sophie Scamps, yes, Sophie Scamps is the climate independent candidate up against Jason Falinsky and McKellar, a very safe Liberal seat. Zali Steggall will almost certainly retain in Warringah. And then there's another very, very strongly favoured candidate against Trent Zimmerman in North Sydney. They could easily pick up, find themselves. I said there's 4 already of these independent 200s are already sitting members. They will all be re-elected. Rebecca Sharkey in Mayo, Helen Haynes in Indi, Wilkie in Clark, which used to be called Denison in Tasmania, and Zali Steggall, as we mentioned before, in Warringah. So they've already got 4. If they add to that number by 2 or 3, they get a significant block on the crossbench, and that would allow at least some of them to determine who forms the next government.
Yes.
And we are presuming, of course, that Labor doesn't get to 76, and otherwise all this is academic. But if Labor hits 75, 74, picks up a few seats but not enough to form majority, I think people are in for a bit of a shock. I don't see the Teals, the Climate 200 independents, coming out and voting as a block for Labor and allowing them to form majority government. I don't think there will be a block form anyway, not across the whole lot of them. They say 6 or 7, 8, 9 maybe, but I think blocks within that will form within that group of those elected to the crossbenches, and that those people will assist the government, the Morrison government, in forming government in the next parliament, provided Morrison doesn't get too far away. He's really got to get 71, 72.
He does.
In order for that to happen.
He does. The reason why I don't think the Teals are going to become de facto Labor allies is that for almost all of them that would be political suicide because they're going to be representing what are essentially Liberal seats. And we've seen what happens to independents who help form a Labor government in
Tony Windsor,
Parliament.
Rob Oakeshott.
Yep. I think Tony Windsor didn't stand again, right. And Rob Oakeshott was defeated. So that's the fate. That's the fate that awaits the Teal candidates who help form a Labor government. I suspect, and I suspect that they know that, and will know that when the time comes for them to make their decision.
Yeah, I'm getting the view though that across, certainly in the Twitter sphere, there's no perception that they think that the Teals will assist Labor to form a government. They certainly won't do so as a bloc. In fact, officially, what they're saying, Jack, is that they will make these determinations individually, and that they will, they take no instruction from Climate 200, that they will make the decisions individually. So, what I would expect is that no block of all of these Climate 200 independents, whether it's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, will support a government, but some of those numbers will provide enough support for the coalition, should it find itself in a hung parliament situation, for it to form the next government.
Well, I think Morrison's, unless Labor gets a majority, Morrison's majority in its own right, or close to it, very close to it, a majority with, say, Bant and Wilkie. Without that, Morrison, I suspect, will go to the Governor-General and advise that he form a government, and he'll be allowed to.
Yeah, that's what I actually wrote about this in the Australian last week. That's what I'm expecting to happen, on the proviso that Morrison features, the Morrison government, the coalition, gets 70 plus.
Yep.
and Labor still falls short. And we might find the crossbenchers with 11 or 12. There are two-party aligned. As you mentioned, Adam Band from the Australian Greens would probably support Labor. Good old Bob the Hat Catter up in Kennedy will be re-elected as well, and you would imagine that he would support the coalition. So there's no movement to be had there. But it is one of those things that not a lot of people are watching closely enough. We did hear Zali Steggall during the week mention that she was more likely than not to support the coalition, provided they got rid of Scott Morrison. That's a bit rude, isn't it, Jack?
Well, she's perfectly entitled to say that. Whether that will work, I don't know. And the member for, is it Boothby?
No, Mayo.
Mayo said that she would be supporting a coalition government.
Yes, she would be inclined.
To support.
And that's what they're saying. Look, it's probably true too. When you look across the board, I think Monique Ryan might be. She's the candidate. She's the independent candidate against Josh Frydenberg in Kooyong. I think she might be a bit of a standout. Maybe Zoe Daniels, but the others, they are. When you look at them, you would normally see these people perhaps in a kind of gentler time as liberal candidates.
Well, Allegra Spender's liberal royalty.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Her father and grandfather were liberal members, and ministers and ambassadors and God knows what.
Yeah. So look, I think you and I are of like mind there. That if we do find a hung parliament and the coalition not too far away from the running, they need to be 70 plus. That I think it's likely that they would form the next government on that basis. Wouldn't need to be, by the way, they wouldn't need to, and this is one of the perceptions that seems to have fallen into it as a truism in Australian politics. They don't need to sit down and write out an agreement, do they? They don't have to sign in these sort of, these theatrical performances, sign an agreement where they promise that they'll provide support for support against a no confidence motion and get money bills through the House. No need
to have a wedding ceremony with bits of wattle in your lapel. All of that's just theatre. There's nothing in the Constitution or in law that says there's got to be a written agreement. It's just a question with the sitting Prime Minister can go to the Governor-General and say, I'm confident that I have the support of the House, and the Governor-General will give them the opportunity to prove that. They will go back and form a government, and it's up to the opposition then to move a motion of no confidence and try and succeed. Of course, none of this matters if Labor can just cobble together 76 or so seats.
I honestly looking, and we'll just get to the polls in a minute, I think that's more likely than it was last week that Labor will get to 76. But it's not a probability. I think the probability still sticks with a hung parliament, but the polling is pretty rock solid now. Labor's gone up a couple of points in the news poll just released today, 2nd of May. Have gone up a couple of points in the primary vote, but they haven't budged on 53-47. But Labor 38. That's where they need to be. They've got to be high 30s to give themselves a chance. On a 53-47, if there was a nationwide uniform swing, which of course there won't be, that definitely gives them enough seats. That gets them 9. That gets them 9, and the ability to form government. But it's just about where those votes fall, if they're going to fall in the right places.
Yeah.
So 53-47, and it's been 53-47 for we're going back 6-8 weeks ago, having come in from 55-45 Labor's way.
Yeah. I actually think it's looking a little bit more likely as time goes on that Labor will be able to form a government in its own right. But, It's a bit,
Well, you never know about
a bit to
polling.
play out. I mean, they've got a few things going for them, that they didn't have last time. Elbow's not Bill Shorten. That's a plus.
A plus and a minus. I mean, Bill did all right in 2016, but
But he was against Malcolm Turnbull, who's a terrible politician. Really.
well, you reckon that doesn't count. All right, okay.
Yeah.
No, he did all right in 2016, and he probably had the right people around him, and I don't think he had the right people around him in 2019. People who would say, no, Bill, that's not a good idea, Bill. Didn't have enough of those people around.
I thought the seeds of 2019 were sown immediately after the 2016 election when he set off on a lap of honour around Australia, having lost.
You don't often see that in the sporting arena, do you?
I can't recall having seen that before. It was right up there with Billy Mackie Snedden saying, we didn't lose the election. We just didn't win enough votes to succeed.
We didn't win, but we didn't lose. I think is that great saying. So look, approval ratings. I don't see much. I mean, the Australian was running with a headline saying that Morrison's approval ratings were better. He continues to lead Albanese as preferred Prime Minister, 45-39. I don't think that matters very much. I'll ask you in a minute. And the disapproval, well, Morrison's -9, I should say, and Elbow's -7. So that more people disapprove of Morrison and Elbow, with just a slight variance there, 9-7. Does any of that stuff matter? Preferred PM?
Oh no, I don't know.
Approval ratings?
No.
It doesn't really. I mean, I think it only matters when you have an opposition leader who is consistently in front as preferred Prime Minister.
Which takes us back to the 2007 example where from the moment Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd walked down the hallway, hand in hand, they got a lead in the preferred Prime Minister stakes, and nothing John Howard could do could shift it. And that was over a year.
Yeah. Look, one thing we want to talk about is people say, polls, they always get it wrong. Well, they don't really. They mostly get things right. But there have been a few fairly significant examples around the world where they've got it wrong in recent times, and they certainly got it wrong in 2019. It looked like Labor was going to win fairly comfortably, and it just didn't pan out. It's put enormous pressure on all of the polling companies to really tighten up their methods. It's
a hard product to sell if you don't get it right often.
If you don't get it right 2 or 3 times, 2 times in a row, let's say, then all of a sudden newspapers and so forth who invest a lot of money in these things go, why are we doing this again?
Yeah.
Look, they have changed their methods considerably. They are using more mobile phone numbers than ever before. It used to be a preponderance on landlines, which would give you a demographic, necessarily gives you a demographic bias. So they're better at that. They're actually better at measuring the other vote now than ever before. Certainly News Poll don't ask, would you vote Labor, Liberal or other? They say, would you, if you are in a certain seat, they will actually run through, would you vote for Labor, Liberal, whoever the parties are, or indeed where they've run independents in the past and they know that they're going to, and of course all the nominations are in now, so they're actually able to run through that list in your electorate and say, who would you vote for? A lot more scientific than, would you vote Labor or Liberal or someone else, which is always going to give you a sort of pretty rough collection of data. So I'd expect the polls, and we should have the caveat that the polls, it's the poll on the day before the election, or even the morning of, that is the one that you need to follow, that you need to look at to see how accurate they are, because you're measuring voting intention when it's at its hottest. So that's what we'll see. But right now, we've seen Labor 53-47, increase in their two-party preferred vote up to 38. The coalition's down 6 points since 2019 in their primary vote. If that polling is anywhere close to support. And that should give Labor enough seats to form government in their own majority, in their own right.
Yes.
Getting to the betting markets, Jack. Well, at the start of the election, it was $1.30 Labor. Coalition were 3.10, and now Labor blew out a little, going up to $1.70, but now they're $1.40, back to $1.40, with the Coalition who got as short as 2.10 out to 2.85 this week on odds just published. So Labor firming there. And of course, the head-to-head market, just to explain, is not necessarily whether there's a hung parliament or not. It's which party provides the prime minister who forms the next government. So it can work on a hung parliament as well. Labor are clear favourites to win in 6 coalition marginals. That's Swan and Pearce. I mentioned these before. Swan and Pearce in WA, Boothby in South Australia, Chisholm in Victoria, Reid in New South Wales. Labor has come into favouritism there again after blowing out. And Braddon in Tasmania, where there's been a little bit of a shift towards Labor. 6 gives them 75. And as I said before, there are a number of other seats, I think 3 or 4 other seats, where they could easily win. They might just be ahead in the markets, or they might be neck and neck with the coalition. So 6 will give them 75. They need to get 1 without losing any. And I do notice that the seat we were talking about, Andrew Constance running in there in Gilmore, that the coalition price is tightening a little bit there too. So yes, we will see. We are starting to see a trend, and that trend, I think, is Labor getting towards a majority government. I think if we had the election last Saturday, I don't think Labor would have a majority, but I think maybe in 2 or 3 weeks' time, depending on how things go, that might be the case.
Could be, yep.
We'll
they're certainly looking better than they were 2 weeks ago. Perhaps another dose of COVID for Elbow might help.
Can you get it that quickly? I don't think you can. But maybe, yeah. You might have to pull a hammy.
Well, after the press conference on Saturday, if half the cabinet shadow cabinet got COVID and disappeared, it mightn't be a bad thing.
Well, there you go. And of course, we've just sort of gone through the whole theme. And Scott Morris, who's almost certainly in Labor-held marginals, is the coalition leader that they dare not mention his name. Maybe we should have a campaign without any of them, Jack, and just maybe that'd clear things up altogether.
It could do. Go back to having local members, you mean?
Well, a bit of town hall debates and things. That can't be a bad thing. Now, we have been covering in our show so far the Peter Knott Memorial when things go wrong in a campaign, and we did the first one where Peter Knott, who was a Labor candidate for Gilmore, we're talking about Gilmore again on the New South Wales South Coast, and he was elected in 1993 despite letting down Paul Keating very seriously by teeing up a media event with a baker in the local seat near Nowra actually, and Paul Keating arrived there and received a gobful from the baker, and Peter Knott was known by Paul Keating from that point in time as the cunt from the pie shop. Very rude and unnecessary. But Peter Knott was
so Peter Knott wasn't one of the true believers that Paul Keating was referring to on election night when he said that in 1993, when this is one for the true believers. He didn't have Peter Knott on that list, you don't think?
No, he had Peter Knott on another list, mate. And I just told you what that list is. It's a list of one, and it relates to the pie shop. And we talked about another moment there. We've had, I think, 3 or 4 stories about Peter Knott, who ultimately was punted in 96 when he lost Gilmore when John Howard swept the country and became Prime Minister. And that was in 1996. And you might have wondered what happened to Peter Knott, Jack, after that. He didn't receive pre-selection in the following federal election. He was a teacher and wandered off. But after, you won't believe this, Jack, after 2001 and 9/11, he became a conspiracist. He believed that it was the government, the US government, that had taken down the two buildings and the plane strike on the Pentagon, and that was his end with the Labor Party. He became a little bit unsteady, in his mind, Jack. Does that surprise you?
Not at all. In fact, there's a lot of people who got a bit unhinged about all of that, to be quite honest. It was a virus that was going around.
Yes, he became firmly of the belief that 9/11 was an inside job, and
it was a missile hit the Pentagon. The usual.
Yeah, it was an odd conspiracy because we pretty much all saw the plane strike the two buildings in New York, and it was in the Twin Towers, and it was like, you can't really convince us that this was something else. But Peter Knott gave it a whirl, and that was pretty much the end of his political career. And he died, I believe, in 2015. So that was the end of Peter Knott. But we'll give you more Peter Knott memorial when things go wrong in the campaign story next week. But that was the end of Peter Knott. He got his brain scrambled in the 1993 election, and that might have been where everything went all wrong for him. And we're just going to wrap up with the week ahead now, Jack. We've sort of indicated where they've been, and it's going to be really interesting to see where both Morrison and Albo focus their attention. Obviously, if the coalition thinks it's going to in a bit of trouble in some of its marginals, it will want to sandbag them. It'll be also interesting to see if they think they're in winning positions beyond Gilmore, or maybe just Gilmore if they spend some time there. And conversely, a bit on Albo's, better where Albo will be, and whether he's looking at marginals that perhaps aren't in our list at the moment, whether they think Labor's going to go a little bit better than we think. What do you reckon Labor's got to do this week just to keep things rolling along?
Oh, they just got to keep absolutely pushing day in, day out. This government's run its course.
And that's the focus on Morrison?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think probably I would be pushing on Morrison, but not just Morrison, but the government itself's run its course. The government as a whole has run its course.
All right. Okay.
To me, that's nearly always the path to victory. In changes of federal government in Australia.
Yeah, we just mentioned that. I mean, I know obviously you're in Hong Kong, so you're not going to pick up these sort of senses. I mean, there was a very clear sense that the government was going to change in 2007, and likewise in 2013, and when it went the other way. I'm not getting that just yet, but I do get the sense that there is a pretty much profound dislike of Scott Morrison, and a sense that his government has had plenty of opportunities. Let's leave it at that, perhaps. That they've had plenty of opportunities. It's very hard for them to make arguments about policy now, isn't it?
It is. The only exception to that way that we change government in my lifetime, really. I mean, even Whitlam, there was a lot of positive about what Whitlam was offering, but even so, Bill McMahon was a pretty terrible prime minister, and the government had run out of steam. It had been there for 23 years, so that was true. Both things were true there. The exception probably was the Hawke election, where people just loved Hawke and thought he could be our leader. But that's not been true of any prime minister since.
Yes, it probably is a sense, if we wanted to try and put it up in a sentence, a view that we might not have that great leader, that great inspirational leader coming our way, but at least we might have a group of people who might be a little bit more enthusiastic about their tasks than the current one.
Yeah, and might have a couple of fresh ideas that help out.
Yeah. Look, and we're going to wrap it up there. But listeners, we'd love to hear from you, and we actually are open vicious criticism, aren't we, Jack? You know, and it can be nice, it can be pleasant criticism, but we're open to any sort of form of criticism, and we'd love for you to let us know what you think about the show, how wonderful it is, or how especially awful it is. Either way, or anything in between. Drop us a line, Mark, to the attention of the two Jacks at the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com. Jack, fantastic to have you with me today again. Enjoy the rest of your day, by the way. It's still quite early in Hong Kong. Are you heading down for some liquid refreshment later on?
I'm catching up this afternoon with a pal who's just returned, just got out of quarantine this morning.
Oh, you'll be thirsty.
He popped back to the US to see his parents and have a bit of a holiday back in about July or August last year. So he's finally he was going for a month, I think. He's finally made it back.
It's great to see that Hong Kong is starting to basically lift a lot of these very, very harsh quarantine methods. So you'll be allowed to get out and have enjoy some liquid refreshment later today.
I shall indeed.
All right. Well, that's great. Thank you very much, listeners. And we'll leave it there, and we'll join you next week for week 5 in Hard Hats and High Vis.